My entitled neighbor secretly cut my fence and stole my private driveway for her daughter's extravagant wedding, so I used a broken bulldozer to trap all 60 of her guests. It's a long story, but to understand exactly how we ended up with 60 luxury vehicles trapped on my pasture grass, you have to go back to the other side of my fence line about 3 years ago. I am Sarah Jenkins. I'm 48 years old, and I work as a senior property surveyor and title examiner at Oak Ridge Land and Title in Pine Valley, Oregon. Until that specific Saturday in June, I genuinely believed I understood what it meant to own a piece of land. My grandfather, Arthur Jenkins, farmed 15 acres out on Miller Creek Road for over 4 decades before he handed the deed over to me in the spring of 2013, just a few months before his heart gave out in his sleep. I was 37 at the time, navigating a miserable divorce, and I had exactly one asset in my name that felt completely untouchable: the land. It included the sturdy farmhouse he built with his own hands in 1971, and, most importantly, the half-mile stretch of private driveway he paved himself back in 1992. He paid for that asphalt entirely out of his own savings because the county outright refused to extend the public road past the old Miller farm, and he was sick to death of driving his truck through knee-deep mud every spring thaw. That driveway cost him exactly $55,000. Back then, that kind of money meant something entirely different. He used to sit on the porch and joke that it was the most expensive thing he ever bought, an asset he could never sell separately from the dirt it rested on. For 30 years, nobody drove on that road except him, then me, and the local postal worker who rolled by at 11:30 a.m. every weekday. I cherished my quiet life. I worked from a small office in town 3 days a week and from my kitchen table the other 2, examining complex deeds, historical easements, and century-old plat maps. I chased down chains of title that stretch back to the 1800s. People think property lines are simple, black and white lines on a map. They aren't. They are the site of more quiet, grinding, vicious human conflict than almost anything else on earth. I spent 2 decades reading about other people's bitter driveway disputes before I ever expected to be trapped inside one myself. My ex-husband had wanted the pristine suburbs, a gated community with a strict homeowners association and a manicured golf course. I spent 8 years quietly starving for the absolute silence my grandfather's farmhouse provided. When we split, he kept the modern house in the city, and I kept the 15 acres and a driveway that cost more than our entire joint savings account. I never regretted that trade for a single second. For most of those 20 years, my only neighbors were a sprawling cornfield on one side and a thick stretch of old-growth forest on the other. That isolation evaporated in the fall of 2021 when a massive corporate development company bought out the timber tract behind my property. They ran excavators from dawn until dusk for an entire year. By the summer of 2022, a brand new, ultra-wealthy subdivision sat directly against my back fence. They called it the Enclave at Whispering Pines. It was a wildly ambitious name for 22 McMansions crammed around 2 curving streets with aggressive speed bumps every 100 feet and a massive stone entrance. Sign. The houses started at $900,000. The largest one, a towering stone and cedar colonial with a wraparound deck and a 4-car garage, was built flush against my back property line. That house belonged to Eleanor Vance. She closed on the property in June of 2022. I met her exactly 2 weeks later when her expensive landscaping crew casually cut down 9 mature oak trees that were clearly situated on my side of the property line. I didn't scream or make a huge fuss. I had the boundary surveyed, documented the encroachment for my personal files exactly the way 20 years of title work had trained me to do, and let it go. Starting a massive legal war over trees with a brand new neighbor felt exhausting and petty. That was my first catastrophic mistake. The second warning arrived that same August. A heavy grading truck, working on Eleanor's side yard, backed straight through my mailbox and snapped my heavy wooden fence post clean in half. I tracked down the site supervisor and politely asked for $350 to cover the materials and repair. He apologized profusely and promised to pass the invoice to the homeowner. I never saw a dime. When I finally approached Eleanor directly, standing at the property line holding my splintered mailbox post, she looked at me like I had just tracked dog waste onto her pristine white carpets. "It's just a mailbox," she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "You're acting like I ran over your child." "It's $350 in damages," I replied calmly. "I'll have someone look into it," she snapped. I quickly learned that in Eleanor's personal dictionary, that phrase meant absolutely nothing. I fixed the mailbox myself for $85 in raw materials and swallowed my frustration, trying to keep the peace. I told myself she was just stressed from the move. The third warning came the following spring. I have 2 rescue dogs, an old golden retriever mix named Cooper and a younger terrier who admittedly barks at wild turkeys. In April of 2023, I received a threatening, certified letter from the Enclave's Homeowners Association. It informed me that a resident had filed a formal, aggressive noise complaint against my property, threatening fines. I read the letter 3 times while standing in my driveway. I do not belong to their HOA. My land is not part of their subdivision. My grandfather owned this dirt before their developers were even born. I called the HOA management company. The representative on the phone sounded incredibly confused when I explained my address wasn't in their jurisdiction. After checking her files, she embarrassingly admitted the complaint came from Eleanor Vance. Eleanor had simply assumed the HOA's authority extended to any property her eyes could see from her second-story deck. The file was immediately closed. Looking back, I was extending Eleanor a running line of credit, one small forgiveness after another. I work in a field built on the fundamental concept that small, unresolved discrepancies compound into massive disasters if left unchecked. I knew better, but I ignored my own professional instincts. Over the next 2 years, I watched Eleanor rule her subdivision like a dictator. Her husband, Richard, was a corporate finance executive who traveled constantly, leaving Eleanor with uncontested authority over her household, the HOA social calendar, and eventually, the obsessive planning of her daughter Chloe's upcoming wedding. What I noticed most was her intense, seething frustration with the subdivision's layout. The enclave had exactly one entrance. It was a winding, frustrating road with a four-way stop and multiple speed bumps that backed up terribly during rush hour. It took her 10 minutes just to reach the main highway. My private driveway, however, ran straight and flat for half a mile, connecting directly to the highway in under 2 minutes. I heard her complaining about it loudly to the mail carrier, to her landscapers, and to the HOA president. I had no idea she wasn't just venting. Eleanor Vance complained the way a predatory lawyer builds a case file. Update 1. The real escalation didn't happen overnight. It was calculated. It started on a Tuesday morning in early April of 2024. I was walking down my driveway with my coffee when I heard a heavy engine roaring behind my tree line. I turned just in time to see a silver luxury SUV blow through a massive gap in my fence, a gap that absolutely had not existed the night before. The SUV kicked up a rooster tail of dirt across my pasture grass and merged smoothly onto my asphalt. I stood there, stunned. Someone had used heavy tools to cut a 12-foot section out of my reinforced wire fence, right at the corner where my land met Eleanor's backyard. They had even laid down a rough patch of gravel over my drainage ditch to make the crossing smoother for vehicles. This wasn't a fallen tree or an accident. This was an unauthorized, custom-built on-ramp straight onto my private property. I jogged down the driveway and physically stepped in front of the SUV before it could reach the highway. Eleanor slammed on the brakes and rolled down her window, glaring at me with visible, overwhelming irritation. "You can't just stand in the middle of the road," she snapped. "This is private property," I said, my heart hammering. "You deliberately cut through my fence." "I checked the county zoning maps myself," she shot back, waving her manicured hand. "This road is a public easement. It's been on the county records for decades. Move out of my way." It was a blatant, calculated lie. I knew it was a lie with a level of professional certainty that most people never possess. I had personally pulled and examined the plat for this exact parcel when the developers built her neighborhood. There was no easement. There had never been an easement. My grandfather's chain of title went back to 1965, and I had read every single recorded document on it. I told her this calmly. I offered to walk her up to my house and show her the certified copies of the plat. "I don't have time for your small-minded rural nonsense," she huffed, checking her phone. "Do you have any idea how many vendors I have coming through here today for the wedding prep? The main road is a nightmare. This is a shared access road now." She rolled up her window mid-sentence, swerved aggressively around me through the wet shoulder grass, and sprayed mud all over my boots as she sped away. I didn't yell, I didn't throw rocks. I made a decision I make every day at work. I decided to build a flawless, undeniable record. That weekend, I bought heavy steel posts, industrial concrete, a thick logging chain, and a commercial-grade outdoor padlock. It cost me $220 in materials and an entire Saturday of backbreaking labor. I sank the post deep into the earth right at the gap she had cut, stringing the heavy chain across it. For exactly 3 days, it held. Then, on Wednesday morning, I found the chain lying in the grass, cleanly severed with heavy-duty bolt cutters. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line. A young deputy came out, took some notes, and bluntly told me that without video evidence or a direct witness, property disputes were basically a civil matter at the bottom of their priority list. I understood. I immediately ordered an $800 high-end wireless camera system with motion tracking and night vision. Before the cameras even shipped, I came home to find bright orange surveyor stakes driven directly into my soil, outlining a proposed road widening on my land. I tracked down the surveying company using the tags on the stakes. The receptionist cheerfully informed me that a Mrs. Vance had hired them to map out a private drive extension, claiming she owned the parcel. I calmly informed the company that Mrs. Vance didn't own a single blade of grass on my property, and if their crew returned, I would file a severe complaint with the state licensing board. The stakes vanished the next day. A week later, Eleanor showed up on my front porch holding a cellophane-wrapped fruit basket. She looked completely different, soft, teary-eyed, dabbing her face with a tissue. I know things have been tense. She sniffled. My cardiologist says my blood pressure is dangerously high. I'm planning my only daughter's wedding, Sarah. I'm begging for a little grace. Just let us use the road for the wedding week, and I promise all this tension goes away. I looked at the ridiculous pears in the basket and told her, as gently as possible, that I was sorry about her health, but my property line wasn't moving. Her fake smile vanished instantly. Her eyes went cold. She turned and marched off my porch without another word. I didn't realize it then, but the fruit basket was her final rehearsal. The climax arrived on the second Saturday of June. I woke up at 7:30 a.m. to the deep, vibrating rumble of diesel engines. I threw on my boots and walked out to my porch. Rolling down my private driveway, as if they owned the place, was a massive convoy, 3 massive catering box trucks, a luxury portable restroom trailer, and 2 florist vans. I sprinted down the pasture to the fence line and stopped dead in my tracks. Eleanor's backyard had been transformed into a luxury venue. A massive white pavilion tent was staked into her lawn. Over 200 white padded chairs faced a breathtaking floral arch. A crew was rapidly assembling a massive wooden dance floor. I intercepted the lead caterer, a stressed guy with a clipboard. I asked him what he thought he was doing on my private road. He looked confused and handed me a printed, glossy vendor map. My half-mile driveway was highlighted in thick red ink, explicitly labeled VIP and Vendor Event Service Entrance. There was a little arrow pointing straight through my property into Eleanor's backyard. This is the official route the mother of the bride gave us, he said defensively. I looked up. Eleanor was standing on her sprawling second-story deck, wearing a silk robe, sipping a mimosa. She looked down at me, smiled a wicked, triumphant smile, raised her glass in a mocking toast, and walked back inside. She hadn't made a mistake. She had built a massive, 6-figure wedding day around the arrogant assumption that I wouldn't have the spine to stop her in front of hundreds of people. I didn't call the sheriff. A police report would do absolutely nothing to stop 200 inbound guests. I walked straight to my equipment shed. Sitting half disassembled in the back was my grandfather's 1978 Caterpillar bulldozer. It was 12 tons of ugly, rusted, unstoppable steel. I had been slowly rebuilding the transmission for 3 months. It couldn't drive fast, and it couldn't shift properly, but it still had its tracks, and it could move. I spent an hour winching it onto my heavy flatbed trailer, hitched it to my heavy-duty pickup, and hauled it straight down the driveway to the absolute narrowest choke point near the highway. I dropped the trailer ramp, fired up the roaring diesel engine, and drove the bulldozer sideways directly across the asphalt. I dropped the heavy steel blade into the dirt with a thud that shook my teeth. I choked the massive metal tracks, pulled the battery disconnect, and locked the cab. Nothing wider than a bicycle was getting past that machine. I intentionally left a tiny, narrow gap on the grass shoulder just wide enough for cars to squeeze in, but entirely impossible to reverse out of once the traffic stacked up. Then, I walked back to my porch, opened a cold beer, and waited. The luxury cars started pouring in around 2 p.m. Audis, Mercedes, BMWs, and a massive stretch limousine. Every single one of them slowed down, looked confused by the bulldozer, squeezed through the narrow gap, and drove down my property. By 4 p.m., over 60 vehicles were parked haphazardly across my beautiful pasture grass. The ceremony started on time. I sat on my porch, listening to the string quartet drift over the trees, and watched Chloe say her vows. The trap snapped shut precisely at 6:15 p.m. The first catering truck tried to leave to fetch more ice. It hit the bulldozer blockade, realized it couldn't squeeze through the tiny entry gap, and laid on the horn. A Range Rover pulled up behind it, trying to leave early. Then 3 more cars. Within 20 minutes, my entire driveway was a solid, furious, gridlocked wall of 60 luxury vehicles. Horns blared in a deafening, overlapping chorus. My phone started vibrating endlessly with unknown numbers. I turned it on silent. 10 minutes later, Eleanor Vance came sprinting up my driveway on foot. Her heels were sinking into the gravel, and the hem of her expensive blue dress was coated in thick mud. Mascara was streaming down her face. She reached my porch screaming at the top of her lungs, veins bulging in her neck. "You absolute psychopath. Move that piece of trash right now. You are holding my family hostage. I am suing you for everything you own. I am calling the police." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my beer. Unfortunately, Eleanor, my bulldozer suffered a catastrophic transmission failure while I was doing some routine maintenance on my land. "My mechanic can't get out here until Monday morning." She shrieked, a primal, furious sound, and pulled out her phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. She screamed to the dispatcher that an armed lunatic was holding hundreds of people hostage. 20 minutes later, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the trees. 2 sheriff's deputies carefully threaded their cruisers through the narrow gap and walked up to my porch, hands resting cautiously on their belts. 60 furious, stranded wedding guests had abandoned their cars and were walking up the driveway, forming a massive angry audience. "Ma'am," the older deputy, Deputy Miller, said cautiously, We got a call about a mass hostage situation. There's no hostage situation, officer, I said calmly. There is a broken tractor on my private driveway. I'd be happy to explain everything. Look. Eleanor spun around, pointing a manicured finger at my face. She did this on purpose. She trapped us. She is trying to ruin my daughter's wedding out of pure spite. I walked the deputies down to the fence line. I showed them the freshly cut wire. I showed them the heavy logging chain that had been severed with bolt cutters. I pulled out my phone and showed them the photos of the gravel ramp Eleanor's crew had built, and the printed vendor map explicitly routing traffic through my private property. Ma'am, Deputy Miller asked me, is this road recorded to your name? It's been in my family's name since 1965, I replied. I am a professional title examiner. I have the certified original deeds and the county plat map sitting on my kitchen counter right now. Eleanor panicked. She's lying. Everyone knows this road is a shared public easement. Ask anyone in the neighborhood. She can't legally trap us here. There are elderly people in those cars. Deputy Miller looked at Eleanor. Do you have a copy of this map you gave the vendors? Eleanor froze. Her wedding planner, a terrified woman named Beatrice, stepped forward from the crowd of guests. I have it, Beatrice said quietly. Mrs. Vance emailed it to me in March. She stated in writing that the road belonged to her family and we should route all traffic here to avoid the neighborhood speed bumps. Beatrice held up her tablet, showing the email to the police. Eleanor's face drained of all color. This hadn't been a spontaneous mistake. She had planned this massive trespass for over 3 months. Update 2. What Eleanor didn't know yet was that the situation was about to get infinitely worse for her, and the final nail in the coffin wouldn't even come from me. It came from the county. The deputies couldn't force me to move a broken vehicle on my own property. They ended up having to call a massive heavy-duty wrecker from 3 towns over, which took 4 hours to arrive and cost Eleanor $1,500 out of pocket just to drag the bulldozer 3 feet to the side. The guests didn't escape until almost midnight. The wedding was utterly ruined. When I got to my office on Monday morning, I did exactly what I do for a living. I logged into the county's public records portal, pulled the Kessler County Planning Commission's official meeting minutes, and ran a search for Eleanor Vance's name. I hit the jackpot. 15 months earlier, in March of 2023, Eleanor Vance had personally appeared before the County Planning Commission. She had formally petitioned for a secondary emergency access easement across my specific tax lot, claiming the subdivision's single entrance was a safety hazard. Her petition was unanimously denied on a 5-0 vote. The official public minutes explicitly noted that the petitioner held zero legal interest in the property and had failed to notify the adjoining owner me. She hadn't misunderstood the law. She hadn't made a silly mistake about a public easement. She had gone to the government, begged for my land, been legally denied to her face, and simply decided to steal it anyway. 4 days later, Eleanor's attorney requested an emergency mediation meeting, desperately hoping to keep the entire catastrophic mess out of a public courtroom. We met in a sterile conference room in downtown Pine Valley. Eleanor arrived with her husband, Richard, looking exhausted and humiliated. Eleanor's lawyer opened the meeting by trying to play the sympathy card, claiming Eleanor genuinely, in her heart, believed the road had informal shared status and that rural neighbors often shared driveways. I didn't say a word. I simply slid the printed, certified County Planning Commission transcript across the table. Her lawyer picked it up, read the denial, and his face completely fell. He looked at Eleanor with a mixture of shock and disgust. Eleanor, he whispered, did you know this was denied on the record? She didn't answer him. She looked at the table. Richard, her husband, who had been completely silent, finally spoke. You told me the county approved the access agreement, he said, his voice trembling with anger. You told me you handled it legally. In that dead silence, I watched their marriage fracture. Eleanor looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes. You don't understand. She sobbed. I just wanted my daughter to have one perfect day. You have 15 empty acres. We have one road full of speed bumps. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. You knew exactly how big a deal it was, I replied coldly. You asked the county, they told you no. You just decided the law didn't apply to you. And I quote, the fallout was absolute. Eleanor was criminally cited for trespassing and destruction of property regarding the cut fence. Because of the county transcript proving premeditation, the prosecutor refused to drop it to a simple civil dispute. She pled out, paid massive fines, and was placed on court-supervised probation. In the civil settlement, to avoid a highly publicized trial, her family paid me exactly $115,000. That money covered the reinforced steel fence, the camera system, 6 months of professional regrading and reseeding for my destroyed pasture, and my $18,500 in legal fees. The social fallout was even worse. The HOA group chat exploded. Other neighbors came forward, revealing Eleanor had tried to bully them into giving up portions of their yards for community walking trails. Richard moved out of the massive colonial house in October and filed for divorce by Christmas. The hardest part of the entire ordeal was the phone call I received in late July. It was Chloe, the daughter. Her voice was thin and exhausted. She called to profusely apologize. She had absolutely no idea her mother had illegally hijacked my land. I always knew my mom was intense, Chloe cried, but I never thought she would do something this insane. I'm so sorry we destroyed your property. I told her I didn't blame her for a single second. None of this was her fault. She was just an innocent bride standing under a floral arch while her mother's staggering entitlement detonated her wedding day. Chloe invited me to her one-year anniversary dinner, a small, quiet gathering at a local restaurant. I went. Eleanor was not invited. My grandfather paved that road because he believed a person's land should answer to nobody but the person who owns it. I used to think it was just a stubborn old farmer's pride. But sitting on my porch now, looking out over my repaired, pristine fence line, I finally understand. Boundaries aren't about cruelty, they are about respect. And sometimes, the only way to teach someone respect is to park 12 tons of broken steel in their way and let them destroy themselves against it. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel out and allows us to bring you even more awesome stories. Thank you so much for watching.